Good afternoon. I'm Adam Levick, co-editor of Camera UK, and welcome to today's webinar, Tampered Evidence, the media's pattern of fake statistics to misrepresent the Gaza war, featuring my colleague, Gilad Ini. Gilad is a senior research analyst at Camera, where he's been analyzing media coverage of Israel for a really, really long time, longer than he's allowing me to say. His analysis has been cited in the Columbia Journalism Review, and his essays have appeared in Commentary, the Jerusalem Report, the Jerusalem Post, Christian Science Monitor, New York Post, and beyond. While Gilad tends to focus on how the New York Times covers or miscovers the conflict, today he'll be widening the net to talk about how many of the largest and most influential news outlets have covered the conflict and manipulated statistics since October 7th. A little side note, whenever while discussing statistical claims by Hamas and media outlets with my colleagues, I often object that I was told there wouldn't be math in this job. Thankfully, however, we have Gilad, who has a very good grasp of the numbers game, in that he's usually able to analyze and dissect the ratios, number, statistics, statistical comparisons, etc., that are bandied around by those dedicated to painting Israel in the worst possible light. Now, in addition to the exaggerated casualty counts in Gaza, Gilad will also address the problem of misquoted Israeli officials, false comparisons, misrepresented statistics, and manipulated narratives propagated by mainstream media outlets. Now, by the conclusion of the webinar, we hope attendees will gain a comprehensive understanding of the intricate dynamics shaping this element of coverage of the Hamas-Israel war. Remember that following the webinar, there will be a question and answer session. And in fact, you can see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and can begin submitting your questions immediately. Now let's turn it over to Gilad.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that intro. I'll do my best to live up to it and clarify the numbers in a helpful way. When I go on a hike, I like to begin at one of those "you are here" maps. So that way I know where I am and where I'm going. I'll start this webinar the same way, since some of you might also like that. So you are here. Thank you all for being here, for being engaged in the subject matter, for taking time out of your day to be further engaged. We really appreciate that, and I hope it is worth your while. Where we're going is that I'll talk for about 15 minutes or so. Then we'll get to some questions, as Adam said, and then we're done. In those 15 minutes, I'm going to try to pack it in with examples, the right amount of examples and observations. So since it'll be packed, I'm going to try not to talk too fast, which I think is my default, and not too slow, which I think is unlikely. And where we'll start on this journey is with a statistic about the Gaza war, the kind of comparative statistic we've seen so much of in coverage of the war. Here's that stat. In just 6 months of fighting in Gaza, Israel has launched more drone strikes on Toyotas than the United States did in the entire 4 years of the American Civil War in the 1860s. I'm not making this up. It's an accurate statistic. An absurd one, of course, but accurate. And I'll soon make the case that media outlet after media outlet has pushed similarly absurd statistics, and that they've done so in order to drag readers toward a specific, unfounded, and even unhinged conclusion about Israel's war with Hamas, the October 7th war. I'll delve into that in a minute. But first, let me quickly set the stage, because the misreporting doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a context where anti-Israel extremists are trying, and sometimes succeeding, at hijacking the conversation. And the media's misinformation serves as fodder for these activists and their message. And what is their message? Let me give you an example. According to these extremists, those of us who put up posters of hostages, posters meant to keep alive the memory of the innocent men, women, and tiny children who were abducted, assaulted, held incommunicado by Hamas. If we put up those kidnapped posters, what we're actually doing, the activists say, is manufacturing consent for genocide. Manufacturing consent for genocide. That's their words. And it's a great example of how the anti-Israel lexicon works, of how their slogans communicate these ugly, malicious libels. In this case, the slogan pushes two such ideas into the conversation. First, it communicates that it's not Hamas, but rather Israel that's genocidal. And second, it says that if we care about Kfir Bibas, the 1-year-old redheaded Jewish boy dragged by Hamas into a Gaza dungeon, that means we're genocidal too. And if we condemn rape, the rape of Israeli women during and after the Hamas massacre, the anti-Israel extremists say it didn't happen. I'm not kidding. And they say that those of us outraged by the sexual violence are manufacturing consent for genocide. These aren't good people. The best we can say is that maybe they write catchy slogans. So let me offer a more accurate slogan to describe what I think is happening. It's not that Jews and our allies are manufacturing consent for genocide. It's that the anti-Israel activists are manufacturing a genocide. They're fabricating the existence of a genocide that they blame on Israel. And they do so, ironically, to defend a genocidal organization, Hamas, a group responsible for the largest massacre of Jewish civilians since the Holocaust, and that promises to repeat the massacre, to repeat October 7th again and again and again. And fine, what else should we expect from rape deniers? But here's the thing, I think the bigger concern. These activists have enablers. Wittingly or unwittingly, the enablers churn out these talking points for the activists, churn out supposed evidence, which is treated at minimum as proof, or at least tills the soil for their lies to take root. And I'm talking, of course, about the media. I'm talking about the tampered evidence that the webinar's title refers to. So as I go through the examples of the tampered evidence, I just want everyone to keep in mind, the examples are bad on their own, but they're even worse because they don't exist in a vacuum. They're pushed out in this broader context of demonization. Demonization that targets not only Israel, but the Jewish community, our places of assembly, like the kosher restaurant in New York City that just had its windows smashed in this week, our kids at school, at the universities. It's context that should lead reporters to be extra cautious in their reporting, but in fact, it seems to do the opposite too often. The way the conflict has been reported has often been brazen, at best reckless, and at worst, malicious journalism. So let's warm up with one of the most famous examples of bad numbers, one you might be familiar with, which is the Al-Ahli hospital. 10 days after Hamas launched its war, headlines blared that Israel struck a Palestinian hospital, killing at least 500 Palestinians. The New York Times homepage, which you see on your screen, added an image of a destroyed building for good measure. But the hospital wasn't destroyed. It wasn't even struck. The New York Times photo is of an unrelated building on the other side of the Gaza Strip. The rocket actually hit the hospital's parking lot, making a rather small crater. 500 people weren't killed. It was closer to 100, maybe even less, according to Western intelligence agencies. And most notably, it wasn't an Israeli strike. It was one of the many misfired Palestinian rockets that were aimed at Israel, but fell short and struck Gaza and its citizens. The New York Times later admitted to its messed up coverage. Editors said that the paper was too quick to trumpet Hamas's claims, in this case, a false claim by the group's health ministry, the Gaza Ministry of Health, as it's reported, as they're called. So I was glad to see that in subsequent coverage, the newspaper, The Times, started referring not just to the health ministry, but to the Hamas-affiliated health ministry. That allowed readers to know that the claims, the casualty figures and whatever other claims, were ultimately coming from a terror group, a designated terror organization. Unfortunately, that New York Times change lasted all of 1 month, I think 30 days exactly. And then the paper reverted to its earlier practice of treating the Gaza Health Ministry as if it's an independent body in a free and open country. Now that's a problem because even putting aside all the way reporters spin the numbers, and I promise I'll get to that next, we can't begin talking about the stats without understanding how credible the source is. Ultimately, the casualty figures come from Hamas bodies, the same Hamas that pushed out a fake narrative and fake numbers about the Al-Ahli hospital. The same Hamas whose leaders have gone on Western television and insisted repeatedly that they killed no civilians on October 7th. Hamas, which has misrepresented casualty breakdowns in past wars too. For example, at the end of the 2009 Gaza war, the Palestinian Ministry of Health argued that hardly any combatants were killed in the fighting. Hamas claimed just 49 militants were killed. It was, they said, even in 2009, when a little bit over 1,000 people were killed, it was a genocide, they said, as you can see on the slide. In reality, maybe 700 Palestinian gunmen were killed, or about half of all the casualties, which compared to other urban wars is actually an impressive statistic. Even Hamas eventually admitted to the true toll. And serious questions have been raised today, too, about Hamas's current numbers. Questions raised by statisticians, by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and even by harsh critics of Israel. Now, none of this is to say that large numbers of civilians aren't suffering and dying in the war that Hamas launched. They are, and it is tragic. Nor does it mean that the execution of this war has been perfect. War never is. War is terrible, especially urban warfare, especially urban war with this subterranean component, with terrorists based underneath cities, underneath hospitals. But what it does mean is that skepticism is in order when trying to sort out the facts. But we've seen the opposite. So with that, let me get to the goods, the bad goods, so you can see how this war has been covered. Shortly after the start of the war, the Washington Post reported that in less than a week of fighting, Israel dropped roughly the same number of munitions as the US dropped on Afghanistan in the worst year of fighting there. On your screen, you can see the data set that the Post was looking at. US munitions dropped on Afghanistan since 2006. And the column all the way on the far right is the one they compare to Israel, 7,423 bombs in a year, compared to 6,000 Israeli bombs in a week. Now, this comparison in the Washington Post was repeated by a US congressman from Wisconsin, a US congresswoman from Minnesota, an MSNBC broadcaster, the LA Times managing editor, several Al Jazeera journalists, The Guardian, a former senior Human Rights Watch official, a ProPublica editor-at-large, a Sex and the City actress, and Jeremy Ben-Ami, the president of J Street. Each one of them shared the same damning evidence to prove Israel was trigger-happy. The problem is the Afghanistan war didn't actually begin in 2006. The war, if you remember, the invasion of Afghanistan, started in 2001. And so to find the actual worst year of bombing in Afghanistan, we'd have to look at the start of the war, which is obviously the period most analogous to the start of the Gaza war. And at the start of the war in 2001, the US dropped not 7,000 munitions in a year, but over 17,000 in 76 days. I added the real numbers there on the graph to the right, but it was literally off the charts. There wasn't enough room at the top of my slide. Let me put it plainly. For their juxtaposition, the Washington Post and everyone else I mentioned simply erased over 4 years of fighting, made them disappear from the record so that Israel looks worse in comparison to reality. It's a shocking degree of manipulation. But the more shocking part is how often the same kind of thing has happened. Here you see a passage from the Wall Street Journal in December. It says that an assessment by the Office of National Intelligence found that Israel dropped 29,000 weapons on Gaza in a little over 2 months. By comparison, the US military dropped 3,678 munitions on Iraq from 2004 all the way to 2010. Same comparison as before, right? But with Iraq instead of Afghanistan. And it's the same kind of manipulation, because the Iraq war didn't begin in 2004, where the Washington Post begins to look. Wall Street Journal, excuse me. It began in 2003. At the start of the Iraq war, in 2003, the US dropped not 3,000 munitions, but 29,000 munitions, the same number as Israel did in 2 months. And we, the Americans, did it in just 1 month. It's nothing short of stunning. In reality, the US dropped bombs at twice the rate of Israel, but by erasing 2003, by erasing the actual air war and the period most comparable to Israel's, the start of the Gaza war, the journal reversed reality to convince readers that Israel actually dropped bombs at 300 times the rate of the US. So we have one outlet erasing the start of the Afghanistan war, another erasing the start of the Iraq war in order to skew reporting against Israel. The Associated Press and the Washington Post erased the entire 2003 war and instead focused only on the smaller scale campaign against ISIS in Iraq in 2014. Here's a December passage from AP comparing 15,000 US strikes beginning in 2014 to 22,000 Israeli strikes in a shorter period of time. You don't have to read the slide, it's just there kind of as a footnote. 2 days later, just 2 days later, the Washington Post shared a very similar statistic. 5,000 US strikes in the 2014 campaign to 29,000 munitions from Israel. Now, these two stories purport to show how Israel compares to other modern wars, but they say nothing about the 2003 Iraq War. And while it might seem less shocking than what the Wall Street Journal did when it ignored the US air campaign while counting US airstrikes, it's the same kind of manipulation. Let me put it this way. If you, a journalist, decide to compare the Gaza war only to campaigns where the rate of fire is lower, but conceal wars where the rate of fire is higher, well, yes, you'll guide readers to the conclusion you want them to reach. But that's not how journalism should work. It's not how any serious pursuit of knowledge should work. In school, if that was your research paper, it would have earned you an F. In journalism, it might get you a Pulitzer. There are more Iraq manipulations, and I think it's important to cover more of these examples because you can't really see what we've seen unless you see how often we've seen it. I'm not going to cover everything, but just enough, I hope, to make clear that what's happening, what we're seeing, what we've seen, isn't just a misstep here and there, but a pattern, an impulse. This passage from Lawfare blog, which is a Washington, D.C. insider publication, at least admits that 2003 happened, so bravo to them. But look at how they purport to compare 6 weeks of Israeli bombing to an entire American war. They say that the Israel Air Force reportedly dropped over 29,000 bombs during the first 6 weeks of the war. But by comparison, the US dropped 29,199 during the entire Iraq war in 2003. Again, it's meant to reflect poorly on Israel. With the US dropped in an entire war, Israel squeezed into just 6 weeks. But again, it's a fraudulent comparison because every single one of those 29,199 bombs, American bombs, were dropped in just 1 month, which means the American rate of munitions use was actually higher than in Gaza, the exact opposite, again, of what the journalist wants readers to believe. And we saw the same thing from the New York Times. They told readers that more women and children have been reported killed in Gaza in less than 2 months than the roughly 7,700 civilians documented as killed by US forces and their international allies in the entire first year of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Again, notice the emphasis. It's not just the first year, the entire first year. The argument is that the rate of civilian casualties in Gaza is wildly higher than the US's war in 2003. It's another stat for the anti-Israel evidence pile. Except it's tampered evidence. Let's remember what the 2003 Iraq war looked like. That war against Saddam Hussein began on March 20th, 2003. 3 weeks later, the Iraqi regime had fallen. If you don't believe me, you can consult with the New York Times itself and their editorial 3 weeks later. And 3 weeks after that, the US announced the end of major combat operations. The invasion was over in about a month. which means the spike on this chart that you see, which covers 4 weeks, accounts for nearly all of those civilian casualties in the Iraq War, over 7,000 killed civilians in just 4 weeks. So again, the reality is the opposite of the one sold by the newspaper. In reality, the rate of civilian casualties in the US war and the purported rate in Israel's war, even if we were to accept Hamas's estimates, are strikingly similar. And in fact, probably they were higher in Iraq between the start of the war and the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime. What this means is that when the New York Times claimed people are being killed in Gaza more quickly than in even the deadliest moments of the US-led attacks in Iraq, that's also false. And its claim elsewhere that Gaza civilians are dying at a faster rate than civilians did during the most intense US attacks in Iraq, also false. There's another serious issue with these passages and so many others like it, and that is that nobody actually knows how many civilians have died in Gaza. Hamas doesn't even pretend to say. They make claims about the number of women and children killed, but their methodology had been so weak, so opaque, that last week, the UN dramatically halved its figures for women and children casualties. Let's zoom in. May 6th, the UN wrote that 9,500 women were killed. 2 days later, they said 4,959. On May 6th, they wrote that 14,500 children have been killed. On May 8th, 7,700. So that also means that when the New York Times ran a front page feature a few months ago, centered on Hamas's claims about women and children, and arguing that there's something different about this Gaza war, as the paper put it, well, the thing that's different is that the paper is willing to take bad data and build a feature story about it, like they did here in this chart. This New York Times chart includes numbers that the UN has since backed away from. It is tampered evidence. The BBC published an almost identical chart, which likewise misrepresents what we know. Same thing with the New York Times front page subhead. Israel has killed more women and children than have been killed in Ukraine. Not only does the newspaper not know how many women and children were killed in Gaza, and never mind how many of those were killed in Israeli strikes as opposed to, for example, misfired Palestinian rockets like the one that hit Al Ahli Hospital, but they also don't know how many have been killed in Ukraine. Their source for the Ukraine numbers, the United Nations, has been perfectly clear in saying that the number of civilian casualties is, quote, considerably higher than the numbers they've verified, the numbers that this New York Times subhead pretends are conclusive. It might be as many as 10 times higher, in fact. So every element of this subhead is a failure of journalism. The Gaza numbers, the Ukraine numbers, and the more than claim. When another New York Times headline announced that Gaza deaths surpass any Arab war losses in 40 years, a reference to 20,000 casualties cited by Hamas at the time, the paper erased 470,000 deaths in Syria's war, 150,000 deaths in Yemen's war, 150,000 in the Gulf War, Lebanon's civil war. On that same day, the Washington Post claimed that Gaza has seen, quote, the largest displacement in the region since Israel's creation in 1948. And they too erased 12 million displaced people in Syria, 4 million displaced people in Yemen. When the Associated Press said that the bombing of Gaza is worse than the World War II bombing of Germany, they erased Hamburg, where in just 8 days of bombing, 40,000 people were killed and half the city's homes were destroyed. They erased Dresden. And if Allied bombings in World War II are meant to teach us something, which is what AP seems to think, why do they hide the destruction of Tokyo when 100,000 civilians were killed, 250,000 buildings were destroyed in one night? Why? It's because part of tampering with evidence is cherry picking, ignoring information that doesn't suit your case. And the reporters are making a case. That's why when sharing damage estimates from Gaza, the Wall Street Journal and the Associated Press cherry-picked higher estimates by researchers while ignoring more conservative professional estimates put out by UN bodies that these two outlets haven't hesitated to rely on in the past. And if that wasn't enough, AP took that higher estimate, which the researchers responsible explained counted damaged or likely damaged or destroyed buildings, and they falsely reported that it referred just to destroyed buildings. They changed the words around to increase the destruction. And they're not the only ones to change words around. When a State Department official said that overall casualty numbers in Gaza, the total toll, might be higher than what was being cited at the time, the Wall Street Journal wrongly told readers that she was talking specifically about civilian casualties. In other words, they made it seem like she was siding with Hamas in the dispute over how many civilians were killed and how many combatants. She wasn't. Journalists of all people aren't supposed to misquote people. But would you believe that the exact same error, the exact same misquote also appeared separately in the New York Times? At this point, I think you should believe it. Not because this error and all the other ones I've mentioned are part of some sort of coordinated plan between media outlets to make the same mistakes, the same type of mistakes. What I'm saying is arguably worse, that it's not coordinated, that independently across our most important media outlets, reporters are so eager to prove how uniquely terrible Israel is that they make the same misquote, that some erase the beginning of the Iraq War and others erase the beginning of the Afghanistan War, years and years, that others still erase the entire 2003 Iraq War, and so on in the same vein. When the chair of urban warfare studies at West Point came across this same type of distorted reporting, he charged that reporters are, quote, hoping to infer Israel is violating the laws of war. He also said that reporters were, these are his words, hunting for data with a hopeful negative outcome, with a starting bias. The fact is, Israel is following the laws of war, and no military in the world has faced the context Israel faces today, he said. The context that he explained is that Israel is fighting a huge force that's embedded in underground cities, that's interwoven into a dense civilian population, that from this dense civilian population is firing indiscriminate rockets at the other side, at Israel's civilian population, and that's sacrificing its own civilians in order to increase pressure on Israel. If this war is terribly destructive, that would be why. But to say as much hasn't been enough for too many in the media. They had to tamper with the evidence, giving fuel to the worst activists and worst accusations imaginable, the supporters of genocide, the defenders of a genocidal organization who charge others with genocide. Americans deserve better journalism than what we've just seen. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Adam, and we'll take some questions.
Thanks, Gilad. You've given us a lot to think about, and there's some really good questions. But first, if I can just ask you a couple. Have we seen any good coverage noting the UN's halving of the number of women and children killed over that 3-day period in any major outlets?
Good question. It has been covered. It was pretty dramatic, and everyone was talking about off the pages of the newspapers. It would have been hard to ignore, though some have. I think when I last checked yesterday, the Wall Street Journal hasn't covered it. The New York Times covered it. I certainly wouldn't call it good coverage. It was coverage in the same vein as the type of reporting that I have just shared with you. It seems intent on sort of bolstering the credibility of Hamas's figures, ignoring those who take issue with it. But they did report it. There was a piece, I think yesterday as well, in USA Today, which was kind of a straightforward examination of this kind of dramatic shift in UN reporting, which is important. It's a pretty wide circulation newspaper, and the people are trying to spin this halving, but you can't. One day, as you saw, one day the UN gave high numbers, and the next day, half. They've backed away. They don't want to use the old numbers. So we have seen some coverage, and some good, and some, as you might expect after hearing this, and after obviously following the press for a while, as many of you have, some not so good.
Okay, we have a question from Ricky. She says that Lawfare Journal's comparison of 29,199 during the entire Iraq War seems to belie the 3,400 plus bombs between 2004 to 2010 and the 29,000 plus bombs in 2003 that you previously referred to. Doesn't that mean that Lawfare lied about the total number of munitions dropped during the entire war?
I wish I had my slide up because those were. I guess I've been bombarding you guys with the same kind of numbers. So it's. Let me see what their numbers were. 29,000 bombs during the first week in Israel. By comparison, 29,000 bombs during the entire Iraq war. So could you repeat Ricky's question?
Sure. She says that Lawfare Journal's comparison of 29,199 bombs during the entire Iraq War seems to belie the 3,400 plus bombs between 2004 to 2010, plus the 29,000 plus bombs in 2003 that you previously referred to. Doesn't that mean that Lawfare lied about the total number of munitions dropped during the entire war?
I think it does. Yeah. I mean, one could try to sort of thread the needle and insist that the 24, you can categorize 2003 as a separate campaign than 2014. Lawfare does that for the same reason that they sort of refer to the entire war when they're actually speaking about 1 month. So yes, their entire their way of framing it as entire, I think, does correct. That was a correct observation. Does erase bombs subsequent to the beginning of the war, which were dropped, of course.
Okay. And this brings me to another question, and I get this a lot in webinars that I give and when I give public appearances, and that is, and I know it's a really difficult question, I know it depends, but what are the motivations? Why do journalists, media outlets continue to make the same statistical errors, and without seemingly the critical scrutiny that their profession would seem to require?
Yeah, I understand why you get that question a lot. It's a good question. It's an important question. There's top level. There's the first level of motivation, and I think there it's clear that the motivation of this tampered evidence, these absolutely distorted and false statistics, is to skew our understanding of the war in order to turn the population against the war. But then the next level is why that? What's the deeper motivation? And I think a whole book could be written about that. Probably, I'm sure whole books have been written about that. And you need to discuss and examine postmodernism, post-colonialism, anti-Westernism, the residual effects of Soviet anti-Semitism, hiring practices at universities, which have come to the fore in the past couple months, hiring practices at newspapers, where there's a generational divide that's playing out between more established journalists and younger, newer hires, where the former is, they've always struggled with impartiality, but the younger ones, I think, are struggling against impartiality. It's a deep, complex question, and you know what? Since you've been asked many times before, I'll give you I'll turn it to you, and I'm curious about your thoughts.
I mean, I oftentimes, and the more and more I do this job, and the more, especially since October 7th, I go back to the fact that a lot of people in the media view their jobs as consistent with their political advocacy, their activism. And I think in their minds, they're speaking truth to power and holding the powerful accountable. And I don't know whether it's an intentional lie as much. I think it's just there. This bug, this internal kind of political cognitive mechanism, which they feel that they have to advocate for the underdog. And I think that's driven by some of the radical ideologies that you've mentioned. But I think it's so common, it's so saturated the media ecosystem, that I think it's sometimes done without malice. I mean, sometimes it is, but I think sometimes it's just so ingrained in their DNA and their reporting DNA that they're just led to find data to affirm their priors. And while there's no easy way to combat that, I mean, I think that camera has held the media accountable successfully. And so that brings me to the next question: is how much success have you or other of our colleagues had in pushing back against these statistics and getting them to report it more accurately?
Yeah, some Washington Post's fake statistic about Afghanistan, where they shaved off everything before 2006. A colleague, Sean, did get the Washington Post to correct that. The many others who cited that same fake statistic, I think, did not. Jeremy Ben-Ami did not. The members of Congress did not. AP's misrepresentation of damaged and destroyed buildings as if all of them were destroyed entirely. We did get them to correct, camera did. The New York Times misquote of the State Department official has been corrected. The Wall Street Journal did not correct one of their misquotes of the same official, that same misquote. The insane stat that pretends the Iraq war began in 2004 remains on the Wall Street Journal's big feature about how destructive Israel is, remains unchanged. I think actually most of the others that I've covered haven't been corrected.
Okay. We have a question from. Okay, we have a question from Barbara. Is camera circulating and proactively publicizing misinformation to Congress and the administration, providing data to Jewish organizations so that they can help educate both Jews and the general public? Need to figure out how to be more proactive than defensive.
Yeah, well, we're certainly trying to get it before as wide an audience as possible, which is why we're here today, which is why we have several pieces on this phenomenon on our website that we have a huge, our letter writing department has a vast email list, and if you're not already on it, please do sign up. In terms of members of Congress, that's not my desk, so I'm not sure what or whether that's been put before them. But yeah, the more the merrier, and I encourage everyone here to speak about it, share our articles, get it before as many people as possible, because it is urgent. The worse the more freewheeling the media gets in trying to tilt the conflict, the more important it is that Americans have this baseline understanding of what we're actually dealing with, and what the largest newspapers in the country tend to do in covering Israel and probably other topics.
Okay. Now, someone asked about the Israeli numbers on the number of Hamas combatants killed, which, if I recall from the latest Israeli numbers, were between 14 and 15,000, maybe 14. Now, I guess the question that this participant wants to know, and what I would know, is, have media outlets been publicizing those numbers, and have they treated that number with more skepticism than Hamas's numbers?
I think on its face, they treat those numbers with more skepticism because the reporting of Hamas numbers is a daily affair. The reporting of Israeli estimates is certainly not. And part of that sits with Israel, that perhaps understandably doesn't churn out statistics every day. They're working on estimates. They're working on their best intelligence. They're trying their best to cut through the fog in a way that doesn't create double the number of casualties that then they would then have to walk back the way the UN walked back with Hamas's numbers. So Israel's not publishing these supposedly precise figures on a daily basis. Now, when they do, usually you'll see it for sure in the Israeli press, in the English language Israeli press, not nearly as frequently as in the U.S. press, though you will occasionally see a sort of aside reference saying that Israel believes the numbers of militants are much higher, but not as much as they should. I think that's another way of sort of boosting the credibility of the Hamas numbers. We've even had Egyptian intelligence come out with a comment saying that their belief is that the numbers sit somewhere between what Hamas claims and what Israel has estimated. So, this is another data point that's distinct, substantively distinct from Hamas's. I've seen, maybe Reuters mentioned that once, or one of the outlets, but generally it's all Hamas all the time. Hopefully, hopefully this UN shift gives us another Al Ahli hospital moment in terms of chastening the press for at least a little while, for at least a month, hopefully more this time, where they'll express more skepticism moving forward. This was just a week or so ago, so it remains to be seen what that does with the trends. So let's keep an eye out.
Okay, Nitsan wants to know, and I'll follow this up. He says the problem is once false information is out, the damage is done perception-wise. Now, you've been with camera longer than I have, and your institutional memory is better. So let me ask you. Now, you cited those false Hamas statistics from the 2008-2009 war, and it made me wonder, moving forward, did cameras work at the time, and the work of other organizations that monitor media content about Israel, did the pushback result in subsequent articles in years later that acknowledged that the Hamas claims at the time were inaccurate? In other words, was there a ripple effect that to this day results in more accurate numbers on the casualty ratio from the 2008-9 war, the 2012 war, the 2014 war?
Let's begin with the nearest term, which requires no memory, fortunately, because my institutional memory is longer, not necessarily better. In the current war, particularly in the New York Times, which is leading as always, it kind of leads the coverage and draws others towards its way of seeing things. Hamas numbers have been treated as credible. They found observers to say that in past wars, Hamas has been accurate. This is a boilerplate standard line that the Times has been saying. It's obviously not true. The 2009 figures that I put up attest to that. There's a little bit of game playing where they say, oh, well, the overall numbers that Hamas had put out at a particular time wasn't that different than the numbers that Israel put for the overall total number of casualties, which kind of is beside the point, because the dispute is over the combatants versus the civilians, right? I mean, it's a harsh thing to say, but in a war, the people who are shooting at you in order to stop your reasonable objectives are people you probably want out of the way, right? There's casualties, Hamas terrorists that are good casualties. There are casualties that you do everything to avoid. So to say that the overall numbers in certain wars have been similar between what Hamas claimed and what Israel claimed is beside the point. So long story short, there is an attempt right now to boost Hamas's credibility. As you said, we have dealt with this a lot in the past. My colleague Steve Statsky has been on the air and written multiple pieces assessing the sort of breakdown in casualties in past wars, showing the disproportionate number of military-aged men amongst the casualties, documenting how Hamas has consistently tried to conceal the number of their fighters who are dead as part of that, as part of that attempt to increase international pressure on Israel. Downstream from that, yes, sometimes we have pieces in Time magazine, for example, by Steve, that then end up being cited in the future. You have a hyperlink from a piece in a subsequent war pointing back to the questions that have been raised in past wars. So every flag post we put is helpful. Right now, like I said, the attempt is to kind of erase the doubts, unfortunately.
Okay. Let me ask you this. I mean, do you think the problem, the challenge that we face in telling the truth about the casualty numbers is part of the problem I joked about in my introduction, that a lot of people have a hard time with numbers, right? So you or others who are good at dissecting this might put together a long, really detailed, effective tweet thread and maybe turn that into a post or an op-ed at an outside publication. But that a lot of people just, their eyes glaze when they start looking at ratios and coefficients. Do you think that's part of the problems with the critical analyses that we've published and that others have published, pushing back at the Hamas figures, that it's just kind of hard to grapple with the details of the misleading claims?
I mean, in one respect, yes. Pithy and easy to digest is better, broadly speaking, when you're trying to speak to people, when you're trying to communicate. I certainly appreciate it. But ultimately, those sort of pithy summaries have to be built on something, right? They have to be built on sort of a more painstaking examination of the data, of the numbers, and it's not that complex in the end. There's accusations that Israel is targeting civilians and harming them in ways that are more than other wars, which is untrue on both counts. The numbers and the comparisons attest to the fact that it's false. But yeah, that's a tricky balancing act where on the one hand we need to produce we need to tear through the data that leads to a conclusion, and then next level, I guess, is to communicate the conclusion, and communication, you want clearer communication. So it's a valid push and pull there.
Okay, Chava wants to know, where does NPR get their information? And they call their news balanced and accurate. And I personally have relatives, family members living in the States, and they have NPR on in the background, and I often get these messages, NPR just said this. What is your understanding of how NPR has covered the war since October 7th? Though I know that's not one of the media outlets that you specifically cover. Do you have any sense?
Yeah, it's not one that I normally cover, and it's just in fact, not only with NPR, even with the New York Times, which I do cover extensively, it's for all of you who are out there, it's been a fire hose of coverage since October 7th. This excites the imagination more than anything, the imagination of journalists, more than what's happening in Sudan, more than what's happening anywhere else, certainly China. And it's really challenging it would take a much larger group of researchers. If we had 20 or 30, we'd still sort of be trying our best to take in all of that stream of coverage since October 7th, which is unlike anything I think any of us have ever seen, in part because where society has gone since 2009, where the sort of the zeitgeist here in the U.S., the polarizations that have occurred, people are journalists are the obsession has become even sharper now. So from what I've heard, and I'm probably not, I haven't done 23andMe, but I'm probably not one of your family members, but I do on my drive home, on my drive to work, on my drive home, try to occasionally pick up the top of the hour news brief, and it's been consistent with what I just talked about. I don't think I certainly haven't seen NPR shining above the or being above the level of sort of manipulation that I've seen from some of the other outlets. It's historically just as inclined to follow these impulses, whether it's malicious or whether it's just this baseline assumption that their journalists have. They're one interesting thing is to see to check in with the recently fired NPR reporter who sort of blew the whistle on the culture there. I don't remember his name off the top of my head. Maybe you do, but I'd certainly encourage everyone listening, if you haven't read that, to track down his essay in the Free Press. And while you're at it, check out James Bennett's blowing the whistle on his former newspaper, the New York Times, which appeared in The Economist, and I think is certainly worth everyone's time. The short answer, no. NPR has reported in just the same way that these outlets that I've just covered are reporting. And actually, let me throw one at you, because your forte, your scope is the British media, and historically, at least, the Guardian, The Independent, others in the British media had been substantively worse than the U.S. media. Is that still the case? Are we catching up to them? What do you see?
Now, I often say that the New York Times has been inching towards the Guardian territory in terms of seeing their role, especially since the, Tom Cotton eruption and the firing of James Bennett, as, speaking truth to power. They've adopted the kind of woke and intersectional and critical theory based way of looking at the world. My sense is, in a way that the Guardian has been for a lot longer. The Guardian's been ahead of the curve when it comes to adopting this, kind of post-colonial narrative. So my sense, at least, again, I don't cover the American media the way that you do, but my sense is that media outlets like the New York Times and the LA Times, which our colleague Tamar monitors, has been getting worse and are, competing with the Guardian. I still think the Guardian's in a category of its own. I am very careful with my language, and I have described their coverage of since October 7th as effectively pro-Hamas. Not that they have Hamas flags in their offices, but just that the effect of their coverage is effectively in support of Hamas. So, my concern is that American media outlets are kind of moving in that direction. Although I guess my question back for you is, it seems with that piece by the New York Times editor, there seems to be an acknowledgement that there's a problem, correct? That this was Bennett you're talking about, who was interviewed in that news article, and he seemed to suggest there is a problem and that, editors really have a serious issue on their hand if they want to retain some credibility. So do you think there's kind of like a counter push now?
There is a tug of war happening in journalism, and I don't want to speak up. I don't want to talk up too much the the more grizzled, the veterans who have been far from perfect for a long time. But it is, I wasn't exaggerating, I think, when I said that the veterans struggle with impartiality and the newcomers are struggling against impartiality. We're seeing, particularly, it's being played out. We see it played out in the New York Times because these younger guys rush to leak, Slack conversations, debates, arguments, leak it to the press, and then it gets covered. I obviously would prefer that the side that remembers and has some sort of loyalty, not enough necessarily, but some sort of loyalty to the idea of objective striving journalism, of impartial journalism, as opposed to advocacy journalism, which I think the younger cohort is really cheering on and agitating for openly. The tug of war is playing out. There just this week, another open letter by young New York Times journalists protesting against Joe Kahn, the executive editor at the New York Times, who had criticized, not too harshly, but certainly critiqued the younger generation of journalists coming in who maybe are a bit too sheltered or a bit too separated from the tenets of journalism that have been the represented the ideals of the American press for so long. He sort of wagged the finger at them a little bit, and they threw a tantrum back. So this is really openly, this is really playing out before our eyes as we speak. Part of it has to do with the hiring decisions. I think those veterans, the James Bennett's, the Joe Kahns, to the extent that they're able to influence make decisions on hiring, need to hire people committed to the kind of journalism that we all believe is the important kind, right? The kind that seeks the truth and reports it, as one of the journalistic tenets of journalism puts it. I think on top, above Joe Kahn, above James Bennett is Sulzberger, who's a publisher who I think ultimately can throw his weight around and won't unless there's a real fire burning under him. So let's all make noise to the extent we can and let journalists know what we expect and continue to let them know what we expect. and we'll see how this tug of war ends up. There might be a generational component, right? Well, eventually, if the kind of people applying for these journalism jobs are the kind of people who are encamped in the yard at Columbia University, which is an encampment led by Columbia's SJP and Jewish, JVP, Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace, whose chapters openly, explicitly lauded the attack, celebrated the attack on October 7th. The established journalists have their work cut out for them, weeding them out and trying to find the gems among them who will try to do the kind of journalism we need to see. That's really important for our country, I think.
Okay, a few people have also asked, where are the bright spots? Have there been any media outlets that have covered the war? If not well, then better than the others?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are better articles and worse articles. There are generally better reporters and generally worse reporters. Sometimes it will break when you look at the bylines on those demographic lines, younger reporters who are being hired as visual journalists or visual experts whose expertise seems to be making videos and graphs more than and weren't trained in hard journalism to the extent that anyone is trained anymore in hard journalism. It breaks along those lines. I think I do focus on the New York Times, and I think they deserve this honorable mention. Everyone is guilty to some extent. I showed some serious issues with AP, some of which they have corrected. That deserves credit when they do correct. People get confused about the Wall Street Journal a lot, right? There's the opinion side of the journal, which is a very,
right.
It's described in most newspapers today as there's supposed to be this big, thick stone wall between the opinion side and the reporting side, and that certainly is the case. So if anyone's sort of lulled into thinking that the news reporting side of the Wall Street Journal somehow reflects the editorial leanings of the opinion side, that's absolutely not true. The Wall Street Journal, as we've seen in this presentation, is certainly as guilty of misreporting as anyone else. It's case by case. I certainly don't think anyone really deserves a gold star. And when people are reading about it, about anything, especially about Israel, I can only suggest that they triangulate, read the English language Israeli press, the Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, Ynet, and sort of integrate that with what they're reading from our big newspapers as well.
Okay. Now, one big question from me, see if you can tackle this. Now, I've written about what I describe as this current, this kind of intellectual academic trend, which is filtered into the newsrooms of epistemological relativism, where, if moral relativism posits that all morality is relative and that one isn't better than the other, then epistemological relativism would posit that, there are different truths. And which I think is kind of part of a larger problem of an attack on traditional Western small L liberalism. To what degree do you think kind of like these big overriding skepticism about the Western liberal tradition and about the search for truth has corroded the academia, and that's worked its way to the newsrooms? And, is there any way that those kind of intellectual tides can be rolled back? That's a small question, huh?
Yeah, it's very small. Look, to the extent that people are being weaned on this way of thinking, it's inevitable that it's going to trickle. Trickle might be an understatement. Make its way into the newsroom, and they are being weaned on it, certainly in higher education. At the same time, I kind of question whether any particular principle, any particular worldview is actually being applied even-handedly, is actually being internalized and subscribed to uniformly. Because way too often what I think we tend to see with any kind of smaller or broader principle that a partisan purports to have, a partisan of anything, and certainly of this conflict, is that it's not actually a principle, right? It's a principle when it jibes with their sort of gut, and in this case, people are coming out of Columbia University and CUNY with a gut that's kind of full of indigestion for Israel and their supporters, the Jewish community. So you know, as much as I think you're absolutely correct that happens, I also wonder to what degree it happens as a matter of convenience when it sort of fits with our gut worldview, our sort of distaste for something, the beginning principle of, well, Israel must be wrong for, they might not even know why they think that, right? What professor told them what. So I think people explain their own biases to themselves using that kind of you know, using that rationale, but they don't apply the rationale elsewhere. And we might have, here's Adam.
I think we're back. So let me finish with a question that a lot of people who are watching have asked in different ways. And you touched on it, you mentioned the letter writing team, but you know, what are the practical things that people who support Camera can do to fight media bias?
Read us. You know, we have a great team. I'm so impressed by all my colleagues working around the clock on this, exhaustively exhausted. You know, I hope you'll voluntarily, well, not voluntarily, I hope you'll, there's push and pull in the internet world, right? We're certainly trying to push things into your inbox and draw your attention to the kind of work that we've been doing. If you sign up, you'll get these weekly overviews of what we've written so far. But by all means, you know, come visit camera.org when you're sort of surfing for information and read us. Let your people know, let your community know about us, but more importantly about the problems. You know, it's not, everything's so polarized and people are so agitated that maybe, you know, it might feel uncomfortable to call it out like it is, but I think we're left no choice. We have to call it out like it is. You know, the way I close my webinar, we deserve better, and we're not going to get better certainly if we don't make noise. Tell your friends, tell the journalists, sign up for our not only our weekly alerts showing our content, but our alerts giving you the email addresses of editors responsible for certain egregious violations of journalistic ethics, right? What we need to make noise. We see on our TV screens that people with too much time on their hands are very good at making noise and dominating the coverage. Most people here, I'm certain, have much less time on their hands, and it's a burden, but a burden that we you know, should take upon ourselves to whatever extent we can.
Thanks a lot for a very interesting, thoughtful discussion.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you everybody for being here.
Finally, I just want to say thanks to everybody who tuned in, who participated. You know, since October 7th, our job has been harder. There's been a lot more media content to digest, a lot more bias, a lot more errors that we have needed to combat. And in addition to everything Gilad said, I wanted to recommend that people follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook and on YouTube. And then, of course, there's our website at camera.org. And I want to appeal to those who are able to donate to us. We're a 501c3. It's a tax-deductible donation. Thanks very much, and have a good day.